You know that article you sent over a while back? The one about quantifying racial bias when it comes to home prices?
Yeah, I remember thinking that was a fascinating one.
Well, get this. They use real estate data, like actual numbers, to figure out how much race plays into what someone's willing to pay, even down to the neighbors.
Oh, right. That paper, Quantifying Racial Prejudices with Housing Transaction Data. What they did was use Zillow, for sale prices and all that, but they linked it with actual mortgage applications from 2007 to 2020, all in Virginia.
Okay, so we're talking a huge amount of data here, but it wasn't just Virginia as a whole, right?
Oh, no, no, no. They got way more granular. Instead of using zip codes, they basically made a circle around each house.
A circle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a radius. They started small, like 0.2 miles, just a couple blocks, and then made it bigger and bigger outward to see how the racial makeup of those immediate neighbors affected the price.
So it's like if more non-white families moved into the houses right around yours, how does that change what your house is worth?
Exactly. And get this, they focused on repeated sales homes, sold multiple times during that time, so they could see how the price of the same house changed as the racial makeup nearby changed too.
It's like a real-world experiment almost,
Hmm?
controlling for all those other things that could affect a house's price. So what'd they find? Did it actually make a difference?
This is where it gets really interesting. Just 10 more non-white neighbors just in that tiny radius meant the home price dropped by, get this, over 1%.
Seriously?
Yeah, and for the average house price in Virginia back then, that's almost $5,000.
$5,000. Wow. That's a real measurable difference. So this racial prejudice premium, it's real and it's hitting people's wallets hard.
It really underscores how much your immediate neighbors can influence what people think your house is worth. But it gets more nuanced because they found that as you make that circle around the house bigger.
So it's not just about living in a diverse area in general, but who's right on your block.
Exactly. At a full mile radius, the impact was basically nothing, statistically speaking. Meaning, it's your very close neighbors, the ones you might actually talk to, that seem to matter most.
Wow. That's kind of wild, isn't it? It really makes you think twice about that assumption that it's all about the school district, those big picture things. Seems like it's way more local and honestly kind of personal. But they didn't stop there, did they? They had to make sure this premium wasn't just a stand-in for something
Oh,
else.
absolutely. They wanted to be really thorough. So they factored in things like the income levels of the homebuyers, which, let's face it,
Can sometimes be a way of talking about race without saying it directly.
exactly. And while it did play some role, it didn't explain everything. They even looked at the political leanings of the entire county.
Okay, now that's interesting. I'm guessing those two things are connected somehow.
You're right on the money.
Huh.
They found that in places that leaned more Democrat, there was actually less of a price difference based on a neighbor's race.
Which makes some sense, I guess, in a very broad way. If you think about it, more liberal areas might be more tuned in to this kind of racial bias. But of course, we're generalizing a bit
Of
here.
course, of course. But it's all about searching for those patterns to get the bigger picture. And believe it or not, they didn't even stop there. They took their analysis a step further and brought in, get this, Twitter.
Wait a minute, Twitter. What do tweets have to do with the price of houses?
It's actually really clever when you think about it. So they took the volume of tweets, specifically using that hashtag Black Lives Matter, to get a sense of the local temperature, about racial justice.
So they're using social media as a stand-in for what people really think. That's kind of cutting edge.
It really is. And the findings were pretty revealing. Areas with more tweets, and specifically more pro-Black Lives Matter tweets, tended to have a smaller racial prejudice premium.
So the more a community was talking about racial justice online, the less likely they were to see this bias reflected in what people were paying for houses. Makes you wonder how much our online lives are actually bleeding over into the real world.
Right. It really shows how these things are connected. We can't just separate the digital from the physical anymore. But we should be careful not to confuse prejudice with discrimination.
Okay, good point. One's about what's going on in your head, the other's about what you actually do. How'd they tease that apart when it came to housing?
Right. So they found that non-white sellers got about 1.38% less than white sellers for similar homes, which, if you do the math, that's about $5,200.
Wow. Okay, that's a substantial difference.
It is. And this suggests that there might be some bias happening even before a buyer enters the picture, like from the appraisers, the real estate agents, all those folks.
So it's not just individual buyers, but maybe the whole system that's putting people of color at a disadvantage from the get-go.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in the buyers themselves. They actually found that non-white buyers were just as likely, if not more likely, to pay a premium for a house in a more white neighborhood, especially if they were buying from a non-white seller.
Hold on, that's kind of mind-blowing. So even the people directly affected by this prejudice, they might be internalizing it and acting on it when they decide where to live.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, right? It's like this
Yeah.
vicious cycle. Certain neighborhoods are seen as less desirable because of who already lives there, so they're priced lower,
Mm.
which then reinforces those ideas and so on.
It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's really disheartening.
It is, it is.
This is all very sobering. We've got this incredible research that exposes these biases, some that we might not even be aware of. But then the question becomes, what can we actually do about it? Because it feels like these biases are baked into these systems, so how do we create a more level playing field, especially in a market as important as housing?
You're hitting on a really crucial point. It is complex, but there are things we can do, both as individuals and as a society.
Okay, so let's get into that then. What are some concrete things we can do to make housing fairer?
One thing that comes up a lot is the appraisal process itself. Remember how we were talking about that potential for bias when it comes to valuing homes owned by people of color?
Right, where we're saying they often got less for their property.
Yeah, exactly. So more transparency and accountability in that process would be huge. Just making sure those appraisals are fair, objective, and that the people doing them are trained to recognize and avoid those implicit biases.
Makes sense, makes sense. There's been talk about using algorithms to take the human bias out of it, but isn't that a little risky, given what we were just discussing about the data and all?
It's a slippery slope for sure. Technology by itself isn't a magic solution. If we're not careful about how we design and train those algorithms, we're just going to end up embedding those same biases into the technology. Like you were saying earlier, garbage in, garbage out.
So true. So what else besides appraisals?
Creating neighborhoods that are more diverse and integrated in the first place.
So being deliberate about building communities where everyone's represented.
Exactly. It's not just about some abstract idea of fairness. It's about creating communities that are stronger and more resilient because they reflect the diversity of the world we live in. And then you've got things like community land trusts, which are another avenue for more affordable and equitable housing options.
Okay, those do sound promising, but we have to be honest here. These issues are deeply rooted in our history, in decades or even centuries of systemic racism. We're not going to dismantle all that overnight, right?
You're absolutely right. It's a long game. Acknowledging the legacy of things like redlining that's going to be essential for any lasting change. You
I'm
can't just sweep that history under the rug.
It's about understanding how we got here, how those historical practices are still shaping our cities and neighborhoods today, and then taking responsibility for creating a different future, one step at a time. So, we've really dug deep here, haven't we? We've got these really eye-opening findings about the racial prejudice premium in housing prices, but we've also talked about the bigger picture, those deeper issues that are keeping it alive. It's a lot to process. But hey, understanding a problem is the first step to fixing it, wouldn't you say?
I completely agree.
Mm.
And while it's easy to get overwhelmed by just how big these issues are, it's important to remember that we all have a part to play. We can each do something, to try to make things a little bit more equitable.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What can we do as everyday people with this information about implicit bias in housing?
Well, it starts with just being aware of it, recognizing that it exists, not just out there in the world, but in ourselves, in those subtle biases we might not even realize we have, those hidden assumptions that can have real-world consequences, whether we intend them to or not.
Right, like recognizing that we all have blind spots and that those blind spots can actually affect other people. It's about acknowledging that our actions, even unintentional ones, can perpetuate these cycles of inequality.
Exactly. And once you're aware of them, you can start to challenge those biases. For example, let's say you're thinking about buying a house. Make an effort to look beyond the neighborhoods that feel safe and familiar.
So don't just default to areas that look and feel like the ones you already know.
Right. Be open to expanding your horizons and maybe even challenging your own assumptions about what makes a place desirable. Go talk to people who live in different areas, explore diverse communities. You might be surprised at what you find.
That's great advice for anyone looking to buy, but what about folks who are selling?
For sellers, remember how we talked about potential bias in that appraisal process? It's super important to keep that in mind. So when you're choosing an agent, make sure they've got a good track record being fair, that they're committed to equity.
Do your homework, ask the right questions, basically. Make sure you and the people representing you are on the same page, value-wise. But what about those of us who already own homes? What can we do?
Being a good neighbor is about more than just, keeping your lawn mowed. It's about building a welcoming and inclusive environment for everyone. Get to know your neighbors. And I don't just mean the ones who look like you. Sometimes those small, everyday interactions can be really powerful.
It's about going beyond just being polite, right? It's about fostering a real sense of belonging for everyone in your community.
Absolutely. And beyond our own neighborhoods, we can all advocate for policies that make housing more affordable and equitable. Support those organizations working on the ground. Let your elected officials know that this stuff matters.
It's that reminder that individual actions are important, but when we team up and demand change at a systemic level, that's when we can really move the needle.
Could have said it better myself.
Mm,
And remember, this isn't just about creating a more equitable housing market. It's about a more just and equitable society for everyone.
well said. This deep dive has really given us all a lot to chew on. Not just the research itself, but what it means for how we live our lives, how we interact with each other and the world around us.
It's call to action, really, to be more aware, more thoughtful, and more proactive in shaping the kind of future we want.
I like that. So let's keep these conversations going, challenge those assumptions, even the ones that make us uncomfortable. And remember, even the smallest actions can make a difference. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.